Hi everyone, my name is Laura Prins and I'm offering a short series of videos about trauma and traumatic stress. A bit of background about me. I'm a psychotherapist and I'm based in the south of England. And for over the past decades, I've worked predominantly with trauma. So I've worked with Transport for London and their train drivers, with South East Coast Ambulance, and with Royal Surrey Hospital, and then also with Surrey, Hampshire, and Thames Valley police forces. I've also done a lot of private practice work with trauma, and that certainly includes a lot of people who work in the healthcare industry. So today the point is to raise some awareness about trauma in your work and how it impacts you. The idea is that the more you know about what it does and how it affects you, the better able you'll be to recognize it when it does come up in your work and you do encounter it. So the idea here is that you can then take some steps to work through it, to process it, in order so that it doesn't cause you any long-term damage to your mental health or to your inner resources, your resilience, all of that. So this first video, I'm going to talk more about what does constitute trauma. And then the second and the third videos, I'm going to offer up some exercises, some methods for processing trauma so that you can keep yourself more protected from the effects. You can think of it this way. We spend a lot of time exercising our bodies and working out to keep fit and healthy, but we also need to do this for our minds. It's just as important. This is about being able to keep your mind as healthy as possible in great times of stress. And we do that best by detoxing and regulating the nervous system. Okay, so these are just some initial ideas I had around the situation that you're currently facing with COVID-19 and traumatic stress. So yeah, the trauma exposure is unavoidable for you right now. There's no way around it. It's going to be happening. You're going to be encountering other people's suffering, other people's trauma, and this is going to be at more of an increased rate. And what I've noticed, certainly in emergency services industry, but also in the healthcare industry, is that there tends to be a code of silence that people adopt. And this is where, you don't want to burden other people. You don't want to put your stuff onto other people. Everyone is stressed, and you don't want to stress someone out further with unloading yours. Nothing wrong with this. It makes sense. The only problem is that this can build up over time within us, and that becomes, I guess, our own baggage that we're always carrying around with us. The difficulty is that these things do remain unprocessed. Okay, so if we talk about the experience of that last point, the concern here is really about two things. One is there's the intensity of the trauma exposure itself, but also the second aspect is about the length of time, because we have no idea how long the current crisis is going to go on for. And more than that, there's also going to be a lot of knock-on effects for the health industry, for, how other people are able to obtain their care and how you're able to deliver that for them. So this is why I think it's really important to start to build in as much recovery time for yourself as possible in terms of stress. Before, during, and after your shifts, if at all possible. Okay, so the next slides, let's see, because this is all about knowing your own threshold for limits and capacity with stress. It's the overflowing cup, and no one wants to feel like this all the time, because feeling like that all the time means that you're living on adrenaline and stress hormones all the time. Nobody wants that. I think we all know what that feels like, and it's not comfortable for a long period of time. So every single person has their own capacity, their own tank, as it were, their own threshold for how much stress they can cope with at any given time. This is what happens when you take in too much of that. So as professionals in the healthcare industry, you already have an extremely high thresholds. Okay, so that goes without saying. But these are particularly stressful times. It's a little out of the ordinary. It's just important to notice where you are right now. I mean, how full is your cup? Is it overflowing? Is it right to the top? Do you still have space left? It's just kind of important to check in and see where you are. It's something that I tend to have to do every single day. And it's just like self-reference, because then that means I know if I need to be extra careful that day, or if actually I'm doing okay and I can just get on with it. So the next slide, let's see. Okay, so what is a traumatic event? What is that? If you have a look at this criteria, see what you think. I mean, based on reading this through, do you think that you've been through something traumatic, either in your personal or your professional life? And I think, especially for the kind of work that you do in healthcare, that first point about the unexpected is kind of quite vital to bear in mind, because oftentimes you have no idea what about you're to walk into, or who's going to walk through your door, what kind of problems they're going to have. Even if you have kind of a heads up, a little bit of psychological preparedness, there can still be things that arise that just really take you by surprise, knock you off center, destabilize you, that are really distressing. I think especially with what's going on now with coronavirus, you know that you're going to be dealing with a lot of people with breathing issues and respiratory problems. But there are going to be details that you just can't possibly prepare yourself for. Don't know. What happens, and this is about shattering assumptions and trust, is that this is what a trauma does. This is what happens, is it shatters our assumptions about how the world works, about maybe, for example, how the healthcare system operates or doesn't. It can actually make you question your own abilities. It can make you lose trust and faith in management. So it has really a lot of pervasive long-term effects, a traumatic event does. The bottom line is, I suppose, it alters your view of humanity and of suffering. I mean, it's just a small fact, but there was a study done where 70% of American adults, have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their lives. So this is a pretty big sample size of the study that was undertaken. And I have to wonder, I mean, especially with the kind of work that you do, that probably that number is much greater than 70%. This is also important to keep in mind. So the next slide is all about the 4 main themes of trauma. So if you have a look at these, you'll see there's safety, there's control, there's responsibility, and there's sort of self-defectiveness. And if you break out any kind of, and I think distill it down to its essence, any kind of traumatic event that you might have experienced or have gone through, that some of these are going to resonate. Usually it's more than one. Like, for example, I can say I got into a car accident a few years ago. And certainly for me, questions around sort of safety and control came up very strongly. And even though I wasn't driving, there was still this feeling that maybe I could have done more, I should have done more. What if I had done something differently? So if you just think about some of the things that you've been through and have a look at these, probably some of this is going to resonate. I think especially in terms of the current virus issue, you know, things around safety and control are going to be huge, because you're not even equipped with enough protective equipment. The resources are, you know, they're kind of minimal for what's required. So I think there's going to be a lot going on here, traumatic stress, in terms of these 4 themes. So it's just something to bear in mind and to keep in mind. So let's see the next one, the nature of traumatic stress. So yes, it's both cumulative and it's singular. So this kind of stress, it comes from one large event, so for example, like a car accident, something like that, It can also come from many small moments that end up adding up over time. So there's this kind of layering effect. You know, in your work, and especially right now, you're going to get both kinds of exposure. The one-off events are weirdly, in some ways, a little bit easier to deal with. But just because you know right away that you're messed up, that you're not feeling okay, that this is definitely bothering you. The cumulative effect, that can be a little bit trickier to notice in yourself. So you might just be bothered a little bit. It might be something that you can kind of push to the side and not think about for a while. But like I was saying, this kind of stress, it can build up over time. And that then makes it more difficult to recover when something bigger happens to us in life. The second point about other people's trauma affecting us, I suppose that's just a universal fact. It's kind of human nature, isn't it? If we're in touch with our humanity, if we're connected to our emotions, then at a certain point, we're going to start to be affected by other people's suffering. And of course, you know, I think we all know this on some level. It doesn't actually make us weak, but it certainly feels like it sometimes. But what it does mean is that you're human and you're not a robot. The other thing is the disturbance to our nervous system. You know, when we're deeply affected by something, we know this because of the symptoms that arise as a result of the damage to the nervous system. You know, it's these physical responses, and emotions create physiological responses in us. So we'll need to cry or shake, sometimes throw up. Our breathing changes. It tends to become more shallow. It tends to rise and just be up here. And our muscles tense up quite a lot. And these are just some of the things that happen. Other things happen too. I'm sure you're aware of this. You know, we can detach, we can disconnect and just not care anymore. So it can go the other direction. We can go that way as well. And I suppose it can be difficult. I've known this for myself. It's actually challenging to recognize the symptoms in ourselves. And that is until it isn't anymore. Until, you know, we're that overflowing cup and we just can't take it anymore. And I always like to think, I think how I imagine this is, you know, that idea about you can put a frog in a pot of water and turn up the heat very, very slowly. And the frog doesn't actually know it's being cooked until it's too late. And I do think traumatic stress has a cumulative effect like that. So it can be difficult to recognize initially just exactly where we're at. Okay, so this next one, this is all about traumatic stress symptoms. I know you're all aware of this, and usually you're using this to treat other people and to notice what's going on for them. It's also important to self-refer and have a look at this. Is there anything on here that you're dealing with at the moment? I notice that I always have a default position for how I deal with stress. And so that's usually, I can tend to get a little bit edgy and a little bit irritable with people. And that's sort of how I know that I'm being affected by some stress, and usually of a traumatic variety of someone else's, you know, trauma and their suffering is starting to get to me. And then if I encounter too much of it, I can have a tipping point where I can just go into detachment. And so that it's important to sort of chart your own responses and reactions to stress. How do you usually cope? What does your system usually do? We all kind of have these default positions. And it's good to know where yours are and where you're at any given moment. Let's see. So this next one is, I think obviously this is very well known in your industry in healthcare. I mean, and there's a lot of talk about it, and people describe this as being the cost of caring. So compassion fatigue, which is secondary traumatic stress, which is dealing with other people's suffering and their trauma. So it is that exhaustion, that deep depletion, difficult mood swings in terms of sadness or depression, but then also just feeling numb and disconnected from others. And I suppose one thing that I wanted to say about these, as well as this, is that these symptoms can take years to arise. It's not always an immediate thing. This can take a really long time. And when they do emerge, this can happen actually very suddenly sometimes as well. And that really freaks people out. So for a very long time, there wasn't really any kind of awareness that it was getting, it was getting to you. And then all of a sudden, the dam breaks and it just goes. So that can often happen to people. And that's really overwhelming. And it's quite scary because you think you were doing okay. And indeed, it's just to remember, just please remember that this stuff does build up over time, which is why detoxing our system and really having a look at what has bothered us in the past is quite important to be able to process it, to allow yourself a lot more space within to withstand more stuff coming your way. So along the lines of this is this next slide, which is about coping, which is the ever familiar, just get on with it. Now, I use this one a lot. I think it's quite effective. And I think especially in the work that you do, you have to just get on with it because you have to remain professional and you have to stay focused. And I know you're doing just the best job that you can do at any given moment. And that often means that we have to push some things to one side if they're distressing and revisit it later. Like you don't really have an option. You don't want to fall apart in front of a patient or colleagues or anyone really. Now, the only problem with this is that it can be overdone, as in it can be relied on to the point where it becomes almost a lifestyle. It's not just a mindset. It kind of becomes pervasive and can take over. I think the best thing to work with this is certainly by any means just get on with it, but it's so important to pair this with some self-care techniques. When it's paired with something else, then I think it becomes really effective, and it means that you can do your job to the very best of your ability without burnout. So that's sort of my point with this. Let's see. That brings me on to this. What are those self-care techniques that we can pair with just getting on with it? Well, the big thing is to show your nervous system that you're safe. And that means invoking the relaxation response as often as we possibly can. So that means from, moving from the sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic nervous system. So into rest and digest mode as often as possible. And what we can do over time is set up almost a cueing system. You're forming a pathway to be able to move your mind and your body from one state to another state with a certain amount of fluidity. You don't want to get stuck in your sympathetic nervous system for too long. No one wants to be running and living on adrenaline. So this is about how do we move into the state quickly, effectively, and without too much struggle to get there. And that's what the other videos are going to be about. But the main point of this, the relaxation response, as certain scientists refer to it as, we can induce this through exercise. That's quite well known, through meditation, also being in nature. The big thing for me is about doing this grounding exercises and breath work. So it's a way of resetting the breath. And that actually can happen really, really quickly. So this is really important to bear in mind. Let's see. It's an inelegant way of putting it, but this is about hacking into your nervous system. And by doing that, it keeps you healthier because you're getting more oxygen into your system. It gets you out of stress quickly, and it works fast. And, in doing a little bit of research around this, special ops use this, like, for example, in America, like Navy SEALs use this as part of their training, is how to reset the breath. Martial arts, there's a lot of breath work there, musicians. So lots of different professions and industries use this as a way to just do their work better. Also, there's been some good studies, I'm sure you're aware of this, about how being in the parasympathetic nervous system more often means that we're going to positively affect emotions. So that, all the stuff about decreasing anxiety and depression, increasing mental clarity, energy, focus, and also improving future reactions to stress. So there's many reasons to start doing these kinds of exercises. Ultimately, this is about being able to maintain a more of a sense of control. And by that, I just mean sort of more stability and centeredness and strength in yourself. So this last one, these are just some things to remember. When we're encountering traumatic stress and we're affected by it, ultimately, it's our nervous system. It's not about being morally weak in some way. It's not about a character flaw. It's actually about a biological and physiological response to a particular kind of stress. The second thing to remember is that talking actually really helps when there's trust involved. I mean, one idea is that you have a understanding with a colleague or a loved one, family member, someone that you trust, where if they notice that you're starting to act differently in some way, you're starting to seem a little bit more stressed or disconnected or a bit edgier, or something has changed, that they're able to tell you, because that means that you're more likely able to listen, and then you can do what you need to do to step away from your edge. Detoxing traumatic stress. This is playing the long game. There's no magic bullets or perfect cure for this. This is about working hard, little and often. You only need a few minutes a day to be able to get into a relaxed state as often as possible. It does take practice. It takes about a month to really get a new behavior set into habit. So you think of it that way as well. But a few minutes a day, most people can spare that, even in times of crisis. So it's just something to bear in mind. And the last thing is about checking in with yourself often. It's so important for you to know where you're at any given time. How much energy do you have in your tank? Are you 3/4 empty? I mean, where are you? It's just important to know these things so you can do what you need to do to then protect yourself and look after yourself. But that concludes the first video, and I hope you join me in checking out the second and the third ones. Okay, thank you. Take care.